They say secrets have a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Mine began on a sultry summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy with possibilities. I didn't wake up that day thinking I'd cross a line I could never uncross, but here I am, telling you the story of how everything changed. My name is Lauren. To the outside world, I had it all: a beautiful house in the suburbs, a husband who provided for me, and a life most women would envy. But what they didn't see was the emptiness. My husband, Richard, was a successful businessman, always traveling, always busy, always absent. I told myself I was fine with it. I wasn't. Then there was Marcus, our driver. He was confident, charming, and had a way of looking at me that made me feel seen. I first noticed him when he opened the car door for me one morning, his deep voice asking, "Everything okay, Mrs. Harper?" I nodded, but my heart skipped a beat. It started innocently enough: small talk during drives, laughter at his jokes, and the occasional lingering glance in the rearview mirror. But one day, as he held the door open for me, our fingers brushed. It was nothing, or so I thought. That evening, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His touch lingered on my skin like a secret I wasn't ready to admit. I told myself it was just harmless attraction, something to spice up the monotony of my days. But deep down, I knew better. Little did I know, that was just the beginning. If you're hooked already, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. The first time it happened, I told myself it would be the last. Funny how lies sound convincing when you whisper them to yourself in the dark. It started on a Friday evening. Richard had left for a weekend business trip, his briefcase in one hand and his phone already pressed to his ear. He kissed me on the cheek as he walked out the door, a cold, mechanical gesture that left me feeling more alone than ever. I watched him drive away, and as soon as his car disappeared, I felt the weight of silence settle over the house. I was sitting in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching, when Marcus knocked on the door. "Mrs. Harper, your car's ready." "I just finished detailing it," he said, standing there in his crisp white shirt and dark slacks. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing strong, toned arms that I couldn't help but notice. "Thank you, Marcus," I replied, my voice softer than I intended. "You okay?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. There was something in his eyes: concern, maybe, or curiosity. "I'm fine," I lied. But he didn't believe me. "You don't look fine," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Anything I can do to help?" I should have told him to leave. I should have thanked him for his concern and closed the door. Instead, I invited him to sit. We talked for hours, and for the first time in years, I felt heard. Marcus listened, really listened, as I poured out my frustrations about Richard, about my loneliness, about the hollow shell my life had become. His presence was intoxicating. He wasn't just a driver. He was a man who saw me, who made me feel alive. As the conversation turned lighter, he made me laugh, real, belly-aching laughter that felt foreign after so long. At some point, I reached out to touch his hand, a simple gesture of gratitude. But when his fingers curled around mine, I didn't pull away. The air between us grew heavy, charged with something I couldn't deny any longer. "You're beautiful, you know that," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Marcus, we can't," I whispered, even as I leaned closer. But when his lips brushed against mine, every rational thought disappeared. I kissed him back, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not Richard, not the house, not the consequences. The rest of the night was a blur of passion and stolen moments. We didn't talk about what it meant or what would happen next. All I knew was that I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. The next morning, I woke up to reality. Guilt hit me like a freight train, but it wasn't enough to drown out the memory of Marcus's touch, his voice, his presence. I told myself it was a mistake, a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. I avoided Marcus for a few days, hoping distance would make the feelings go away. It didn't. When he picked me up for errands or dropped me off at appointments, the tension between us was palpable. Every glance, every word, every touch sent shivers down my spine. One evening, after Richard returned from another business trip, Marcus lingered outside after parking the car. I watched him through the window, his figure illuminated by the porch light. He glanced up, and our eyes met. In that moment, I realized I didn't want to stop. The thrill, the danger, the escape. It was worth the risk. If you're caught up in this dangerous game, don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories of passion. It's funny how you think you can control a secret. You convince yourself that if you're careful, if you play your part right, no one will ever know. But secrets have a way of slipping through the cracks, and mine was no different. After that first night with Marcus, things spiraled faster than I could have imagined. It didn't stop at stolen kisses or hushed whispers in the car. We became reckless, meeting in the house while Richard was at work, sneaking glances at each other during family events, and inventing excuses for me to need a driver. But secrets breed suspicion. It started small. Richard began to notice that I was on edge, that I avoided his touch, that my laughter seemed forced. He asked questions, casual ones at first. "Everything okay? What did you do today?" I answered them with rehearsed ease, but his eyes lingered too long, his tone too sharp. One evening, as Marcus dropped me off after a supposed shopping trip, Richard was standing by the window. He didn't say anything, but his eyes followed Marcus's car as it drove away. "Who is Marcus to you, Lauren?" he asked, his voice calm but cold. I froze. "He's our driver, Richard." "What kind of question is that?" He didn't answer, just stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. The next few weeks were a tightrope walk. I tried to act normal, to play the role of the dutiful wife, but I could feel the walls closing in. Richard started coming home earlier than usual, calling during the day to check in, and keeping a closer eye on me. And then there was Marcus. He'd changed too. The carefree charm that had drawn me to him was now tinged with something darker. He was possessive, demanding more of my time, and growing impatient with my caution. "You can't keep pretending, Lauren," he said one night as we sat in his car. "You're miserable with him, and you know it." "I can't just walk away, Marcus," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that simple." He leaned closer, his hand gripping mine. "It is if you want it to be." But I couldn't give him the answer he wanted, and the tension between us grew. Then came the day Richard set his trap. It was a Saturday. Richard claimed he had an all-day meeting downtown, leaving me home alone. Marcus and I took the opportunity to meet at the house, something we hadn't dared to do in weeks. We were in the living room, caught in an embrace, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. Panic surged through me. "Richard's here," I whispered, pulling away from Marcus. But it was too late. The door swung open, and there he stood. Richard's face was a mask of fury and betrayal. His eyes darted between Marcus and me, taking in the scene with horrifying clarity. "So this is what you do while I'm working to provide for you," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "Richard, I can explain." "Don't," he snapped, cutting me off. "I don't want your lies, Lauren. I want the truth." Marcus stepped forward, his posture defiant. "Maybe if you treated her right, she wouldn't have needed someone else." That was the breaking point. Richard lunged at Marcus, and the two of them collided in a blur of fists and shouts. I screamed, begging them to stop, but they were consumed by their anger. When it was over, Marcus left, his face bruised but his pride intact. Richard stood there, breathing heavily, his gaze fixed on me. "Pack your things," he said finally. "I want you out of my house by tomorrow." I opened my mouth to plead, to apologize, but the look in his eyes silenced me. For the first time, I realized the full weight of what I had done. I spent the night in a guest room, the weight of my actions pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Every creak of the house reminded me of the life I had destroyed. The silence between Richard and me was louder than any argument we could have had. When dawn broke, I packed my bags as he demanded. I hesitated at the threshold of our bedroom, staring at the perfectly made bed we'd shared for years. It was strange to think how easily something that felt permanent could be dismantled in a single moment. Richard was in his office when I came downstairs, his back turned to me as he stared out the window. I stood there for a moment, clutching my suitcase, waiting for him to acknowledge me. "Are you going to say anything?" I finally asked, my voice breaking. He turned slowly, his expression unreadable. What do you want me to say, Lauren? That I forgive you? That we can go back to the way things were? I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. You betrayed me, he continued, his voice like ice. You didn't just cheat on me. You shattered everything we built. Tears streamed down my face as I tried to find the courage to speak. I'm sorry, Richard. I know that doesn't mean much now, but I am... Sorry doesn't fix this, he said sharply. You made your choice, Lauren. Now you have to live with it. I left the house with my suitcase in one hand and a hollow ache in my chest. I didn't have a plan, no idea where I was going or what I would do. The only thing I knew was that I'd lost everything. Over the next few weeks, I stayed in a small motel on the edge of town. Marcus tried to reach out, leaving voicemails and sending texts, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. Whatever we had was over. I couldn't look at him without seeing the wreckage we'd caused. Richard filed for divorce quickly, and the process was as cold and clinical as our last conversation. He kept the house, the cars, and the life we'd built together. I didn't fight him, I didn't have the right. One afternoon, as I sat in the dingy motel room, I received a message from him. It wasn't long, just a single line. I hope you find what you're looking for. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, his words echoing in my mind. Months later, I returned to the house to pick up the last of my belongings. It felt strange to walk through the rooms that had once been my sanctuary. The memories lingered like ghosts, haunting me with what could have been. Richard was there, waiting for me in the living room. He looked different, older, maybe, or just tired. Thank you for letting me come by, I said, breaking the silence. He nodded, his gaze distant. You look well. Better than I feel, I admitted, my voice tinged with regret. We stood there for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. Why, Lauren, he asked suddenly, his voice quiet but filled with pain. Why wasn't I enough? I felt a lump rise in my throat as I searched for an answer. It wasn't about you, Richard. It was about me. I felt invisible, and I made the worst mistake of my life, trying to feel something. He shook his head, his eyes filled with disappointment. I gave you everything. I know, I whispered. And I'm sorry. As I turned to leave, he called out to me one last time. I hope you find a way to forgive yourself someday. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything, I can't help but wonder if forgiveness is even possible. I destroyed my marriage, broke the trust of a man who loved me. And for what? A fleeting moment of passion that cost me everything. If you've ever made a choice that changed your life forever, tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of heartbreak and redemption. The road I've walked is one I wouldn't wish on anyone, but maybe my story can be a warning. Some lines, once crossed, can never be uncrossed.